Chapter 26 of Book 1 of Prior Analytics by Aristotle, translated by Octavius Owen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Chapter 26 on the comparative difficulty of certain problems, and by what figures they are proved. Since we have those particulars with which syllogisms are conversant, and what is their quality in each figure, and in how many ways demonstration takes place, it is also manifest to us what kind of problem is difficult, and what easy of proof, for that which is concluded in many figures, and through many cases, is more easy, but what is in fewer figures, and by fewer cases, is more difficult. An universal affirmative then is proved through the first figure alone, and by this in one way only, but a negative both through the first and through the middle, through the first in one way, but through the middle in two ways, the particular affirmative again through the first and through the last, in one way through the first figure, but in three ways through the last. Lastly, the particular negative is proved in all the figures, but in the first in one way, in the middle in two ways, and in the last in three ways. Hence it appears most difficult to construct an universal affirmative, but most easy to subvert it. In short, universals are easier to subvert than particulars, because the former are subverted, whether a thing is present with nothing, or is not with a certain thing, of which the one, namely, the not being with a certain thing, is proved in all the figures, and the other, the being with nothing, is proved in two. The same mode also prevails in the case of negatives, for the original proposition is subverted, whether a thing is with every, or with a certain individual. Now this was in two figures. In particular problems there is one way of computation, either by showing a thing to be with every, or with no individual, and particular problems are easier of construction, for they are in more figures, and through more modes. In short, we ought not to forget that it is possible to confute universal mutually through particular problems, and these through universal, yet we cannot construct universal through particular, but the latter may be through the former. At the same time, that it is easier to subvert than to construct is plain. In what manner then every syllogism arises, through how many terms and premises, how they subsist with reference to each other, also what sort of problem may be proved in each figure, and what in many and in fewer modes may be gathered from what has been said. Chapter 27 of the invention and construction of syllogisms. We must now describe how we may always obtain a provision of syllogisms for a proposed question, and in what way we may assume principles about each. For perhaps it is not only requisite to consider the production of syllogisms, but also to possess the power of forming them. Of all beings then, some are of such a nature as not to be truly predicated universally of anything else, as Cleon and Callias, that which is singular, and that which is sensible, but others are predicated of these, for each of these is man and animal. Some again are predicated of others, but others not previously of these. Lastly, there are some which are themselves predicated of others, and others of them, as man is predicated of Callias, and animal of man. That some things therefore are naturally adapted to be predicated of nothing is clear, for of sensibles each is almost of such a sort as not to be predicated of anything except accidentally, for we sometimes say that white thing is Socrates, and that the object approaching is Callias, but that we must stop somewhere in our upward progression, we will again show, for the present let this be admitted. Of these things then we cannot point out another predicate, except according to opinion, but these may be predicated of others, nor can singulars be predicated of others, but others of them. It appears, however, that those which are intermediate are capable in both ways of demonstration, for they may be predicated of others, and others of them, and arguments and speculations are almost all conversant with these. Still, it is requisite to assume the propositions about each thing thus. In the first place, the subject, by hypothesis, the definitions, and such peculiarities as exist of the thing. Next, whatever things are consequent to the thing, and which the thing follows. Lastly, such as cannot be in it. Those, however, which it cannot be in are not to be assumed, because of the conversion of the negative. We must also distinguish in the consequence what things belong to "what a thing is," what are predicated as properties, and what as accidents. Also of these, those which are predicated according to opinion, and those according to truth. For the greater number any one has of these, the quicker will he light upon a conclusion, and the more true they are, the more will he demonstrate. We must too select not those which are consequent to a certain one, but those which follow the whole thing, e.g., not what follows a certain man, but what follows every man. For a syllogism consists of universal propositions. If therefore a proposition is indefinite, it is doubtful whether it is universal, but when it is definite, this is manifest. So also we must select those things the whole of which a thing follows, for the reason given above, but the whole consequent itself need not be assumed to follow. I say, for instance, it must not be assumed that every "animal" is consequent to "man," or every science to music, but only that they are simply consequent, as we set forth. For the other is useless and impossible, as that "every man" is "every animal," or that "justice is everything good." To whatever subject a consequent is attached, the sign "every" is added. When, however, the subject is comprehended by a certain thing, the consequence of which we must assume, those which follow, or which do not follow the universal, we are not to select in these, for they were assumed in those, since whatever are consequent to "animal" are also consequent to "man," and as to whatever things are not absolutely present with, in like manner. But the properties of each thing must be taken, for there are certain properties in species not common to genus, since it is necessary that certain properties should be in different species, nor are we to select those in regard to the universal, which the thing comprehended follows, as those which "man" follows ought not to be assumed to "animal," for it is necessary, if animal follows man, that it follows all these, but these more properly belong to the selection of the antecedents of "man." We must also assume those which are generally consequent and antecedent, for of general problems the syllogism also is from propositions, all or some of which are general, as the conclusion of each syllogism resembles its principles. Lastly, we are not to select things consequent to all, since there will not be composed a syllogism from them, on account of a reason which will appear from what follows. Chapter 28. Special rules upon the same subject. Those therefore who desire to confirm anything of a certain universal should look to the subject matter of what is confirmed. in respect of which it happens to be predicated, but of whatever ought to be predicated, of this he should examine the consequence. For if one of these happens to be the same, one must necessarily be in the other. But if it is to be proved that a thing is not present universally, but particularly, he must examine those which each follows. For if any of these is the same, to be particularly present is necessary. But when the presence with nothing is necessary, as to what it need not be present with, we must look to those which cannot be present with it, or on the contrary, as regards that, with which it is necessary not to be present. We must look to those which cannot be with it, but as to what ought not to be present, to the consequence. For whichever of these are identical, it will happen that the one is in no other, since sometimes a syllogism arises in the first, and at other times in the middle figure. If however the particular non-inesse is to be proved, that with which it ought not to be present, and those which it follows, are to be looked to, but of that which ought not to be present, those must be considered, which it is impossible can be in it. For if any of these be identical, the particular non-inesse is necessary. What has been said, however, will perhaps be more clear thus. Let the consequence to A be B, but let those to which it is consequent be C. Those again which cannot be in it, D. Again, let the things present with E be F, and those to which it is consequent, G. Lastly, those which cannot be in it, H. Now, if a certain C and a certain F are identical, it is necessary that A should be with every E, for F is present with every E, and A with every C, so that A is with every E. But if C and G are identical, A must necessarily be with a certain E, for A follows every C, and E every G. If, however, F and D are identical, A will be with no E from a prosyllogism, for since a negative is convertible, and F is identical with D, A will be with no F, but F is with every E. Again, if B and H are the same, A will be with no E, for B is with every A, but with no E, for it was the same as H, and H was with no E. If D and G are identical, A will not be with a certain E, for A will not be with G, since it is not present with D, but G is under E, so that neither will it be with a certain E. Moreover, if B is identical with G, there will be an inverse syllogism, for G will be with every A, since B is with A, and E with B, for B is the same as G. Still, it is not necessary that A should be with every E, but it is necessary that it be with a certain E, because an universal predication may be converted into a particular one. Wherefore, we must evidently regard what has been mentioned as to each part of every problem, since all syllogisms are from these, but in consequence, and the antecedents of each thing, we must look to first elements, and to those which are for the most part universal, as in the case of E, we must look more to K, F, than only to F, but in the case of A, more to K, C, than to C only, for if A is present with K, C, it is also present with F, and with E, but if it is not consequent to this, yet it may be consequent to F. In like manner, we must examine those which the thing itself is consequent to, for if it follows the primary, it also does those which are included under them, and if it does not follow these, yet it may those which are arranged under them. Speculation then, plainly, consists of 3 terms, and 2 propositions, and all syllogisms are through the above mentioned figures. For A is shown present with every E, when of C and F something identical may be assumed. Now this will be the middle term, and A and E the extremes, and there is the first figure, but presence with a certain thing is shown when C and G are assumed identical, and this is the last figure, for G becomes the middle. Again, presence with none, when D and F are identical, but thus also the first figure and the middle are produced. The first because A is with no F, since a negative is converted, but F is with every E, and the middle because D is with no A, but with every E. Not to be present also with a certain one is shown when D and G are the same, and this is the last figure, for A will be with no G, and E with every G, wherefore all syllogisms are evidently through the above named figures, and we must not select those which are consequent to all, because no syllogism arises from them, as in short we cannot construct from consequence, nor deduce a negative through an universal consequent, for it must be in one and not in the other. That other modes of speculation also, as regards selection, are useless for the construction of syllogism is apparent. For instance, if the consequents to each are identical, or if those which A the predicate follows, and which cannot be with E the subject, or again those which cannot concur to be with either, for no syllogism arises through these. If then the consequents are identical, as B and F, the middle figure is produced, having both premises affirmative. But if those which A follows, and which cannot be with E, as C and H, there will be the first figure, having the minor premise negative. Again, if those are identical which cannot be with either, as D and H, both propositions will be negative, either in the first or in the middle figure. Thus, however, there will by no means be a syllogism. We see moreover that we must assume in speculation things identical, and not what are different, or contrary. First, because our inspection is for the sake of the middle, and we must take as a middle not what is different, but what is identical. Next, in whatever a syllogism happens to be produced from the assumptions of contraries, or of those things which cannot be with the same, all are reduced to the before named modes, as if B and F are contraries, or cannot be with the same thing. If these are assumed, there will be a syllogism that A is with no E. This, however, does not result from them, but from the above named mode, for B is with every A, and with no E, so that B must necessarily be identical with a certain H. Again, if B and G do not concur to be with the same thing, it will follow that A will not be with a certain E, and so there will be the middle figure, for B is with every A, and with no G, so that B must necessarily be identical with some H, for the impossibility of B and G being in the same thing does not differ from B being the same as a certain H, since everything is assumed which cannot be with E. From these observations, then, it is shown that no syllogism arises, but if B and F are contraries, B must necessarily be identical with a certain H, and a syllogism arises through these. Nevertheless, it occurs to persons thus inspecting that they look to a different way than the necessary from the identity of B and H escaping them. Chapter 29. The same method applied to other than categorical syllogisms. Syllogisms which lead to the impossible subsist in the same manner as ostensive, for these also arise through consequence, and those antecedents which each follows, and the inspection is the same in both, for what is ostensively demonstrated may be also syllogistically inferred per impossible, and through the same terms, and what is demonstrated per impossible may be also proved ostensively, as that A is with no E. For let it be supposed to be with a certain E, therefore, since B is with every A, and A with a certain E, B also will be with a certain E, but it was present with none. Again, it may be shown that A is with a certain E, for if A is with no E, but E is with every H, A will be with no H, but it was supposed to be with every H. It will happen the same in other problems, for always and in all things demonstration per impossible will be from consequence, and from those which each follows. In every problem also there is the same consideration, whether a man wishes to syllogize ostensively, or to lead to the impossible, since both demonstrations are from the same terms, as for example, if A were shown to be with no E, because B happens to be with a certain E, which is impossible. If it is assumed that B is with no E, but with every A, it is evident that A will be with no E. Again, if it is ostensively collected that A is with no E, to those who suppose that it is with a certain E, it may be shown per impossible to be with no E. The like will also occur in other cases, for in all we must assume some common term different from the subject terms to which there will appertain a syllogism of the false, so that this proposition being converted, but the other remaining the same, there will be an ostensive syllogism through the same terms. But an ostensive syllogism differs from that per impossible, because in the ostensive both premises are laid down according to truth, but in that which leads to the impossible, one is laid down falsely. These things, however, will more fully appear by what follows, when we come to speak of the impossible. For the present, let so much be manifest to us, that both he who wishes to syllogize ostensively and per impossible must observe these things. In other syllogisms, indeed, which are hypothetical, such as those which are according to transumption, or according to quality, the consideration will be in the subject terms, not in the original ones, but in those taken afterwards, but the mode of inspection will be the same. But it is necessary also to consider and distinguish in how many ways hypothetical syllogisms arise. Each problem then is demonstrated thus, and some of them we may infer syllogistically after another method. For example, universals by an hypothetical inspection of particulars, for if C and H are the same, and if E is assumed to be with H alone, A will be with every E, and again if D and H are the same, and E is predicated of H alone, it may be shown that A is with no E. Wherefore the inspection must clearly be in this way after the same manner, both in the necessary and contingent, for the consideration is the same, and the syllogism, both of the contingent and the absolute, will be through terms the same in order. In the contingent, however, we may assume things which are not with, but which may be, for it has been shown that by these a contingent syllogism is produced, and the reasoning is similar in the case of the other predications. From what has been said then, it appears not only that it is allowable for all syllogisms to be formed in this, but that they cannot be formed in any other way. For every syllogism has been shown to originate through some one of the before named figures, and these may not be constituted through any other than the consequence and antecedents of a thing, for from these are the premises and assumption of the middle, so that it is not admissible that a syllogism should be produced through other things. Chapter 30. The preceding method of demonstration applicable to all problems. The way then of proceeding in all problems, both in philosophy and in every art and discipline, is the same, for we must collect about each of them those things which are with, and the subjects which they are with, and be provided with as many as possible of these, considering them also through three terms, in one way subverting, but in another constructing, according to truth, we reason from those which are truly described to be inherent, but as regards dialectic syllogisms, we must reason from probable propositions. Now the principles of universal syllogisms have been mentioned, how they subsist, and how we must investigate them, that we may not direct our attention to everything which is said, nor to constructing and subverting the same things, nor both constructing universally or particularly, nor subverting wholly or partially, but look to things fewer and definite. As to each, however, we must make a selection, as of good or of science. The peculiar principles indeed in every science are many. Hence it is the province of experience to deliver the principles of everything. For instance, I say that astrological experience gives the principles of astrological science, for from phenomena being sufficiently assumed, astrological demonstrations have thus been invented. So also is it in every other art and science. Wherefore, if things are assumed which exist in individuals, it is now our duty readily to exhibit demonstrations. For if as regards history nothing is omitted of what is truly present with things, we shall be able about everything of which there is demonstration to discover and demonstrate this, and to make that clear which is naturally incapable of demonstration. Universally then, we have nearly shown how propositions ought to be selected, but we have discussed this accurately in the treatise on dialectic. End of chapter 30. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.